I don't know if you can relate to anything in that video, but every time I see it, I think of my extended family. And it's because I have this network of aunts and uncles and cousins that are just this like adrenaline junkie, adventure-loving group of people. And throughout my childhood growing up, there would be a couple of times where we would meet out at Lake Powell in Utah. Raise your hand if you've ever been to Lake Powell. A handful. Yeah, it's kind of this like, nobody knows about it, but it's this beautiful place, and it feeds into the Grand Canyon. It's absolutely amazing. And we would meet out here, and all the families would connect, and we would rent a houseboat for a week and just stay on the houseboat and basically play, cliff jump, jet ski, boats, like all sorts of fun stuff. And at some point, because it's this side of the family that they would go for the higher cliffs many times, at some point, this thing would come out and make an appearance. The banana inner tube. Raise your hand if you've ever ridden on one of these before. Okay, yeah, you're nodding and you're like chuckling to yourself because you know, depending on who is driving the boat, key thing, depending on who is driving the boat, this can get very violent. Because you have 5 to 7 people who are on it, and when you fall off, what tends to happen for some reason is you all go down together. And so limbs are flailing, you get like black eyes and bloody noses, and I'm seeing some of you nod, so I know you've experienced this. And for me and my extended family, what would happen, I think, this was never said, but if you've ever heard of those civilizations where like boys get sent off into the woods to kill a bear and they come back a man, for me and my extended family, when my Uncle Ronnie is driving the boat, and you get on the banana tube, you will get on it as a boy and you will come back a man if you live to tell the tale. Okay? And I want to show you what I mean by this, because one time he was driving the boat and they put me at the front, and my parents had a good camera, and so I was 14 years old and they captured a picture of me, and this is the main channel, so it is terrifying, and there's about 6 of us on this thing, and I just want to zoom in there so you can see exactly what I was feeling in this moment. Yeah, pure terror. And I get a little emotional when I see this picture too, because it reminds me of my midlife hair crisis that I'm going through. I really miss that hair right there. But you could say I was not winning at life in that moment. I didn't feel like it. And I share that because we began this series, as you know, a few weeks back called The Beginner's Guide to Winning at Life. And I personally love the title of the series. It's slightly challenging and humbling, but it puts all of us in the posture of a beginner. Meaning we don't automatically get life right just by willpower or good intentions, right? I mean, we said in part 1 of the series, Jordan said, quoting Andy Stanley, that it is actually our direction, not our intention, that determines where we end up in our life. And we all have great intentions, which is why we want to get curious about our direction, make some changes there, and with the various directions we have in our life, with the various key areas of our life, the challenge has been this. Has been to align our daily practices with our deepest values. To not just align our intentions, because we have great intentions in our life, but to align what we do on a weekly, daily, monthly, annually, quarterly basis that most supports what is most meaningful to us and meaningful to God as well. And we've been talking about this idea. It's called a rule of life, and it's actually a concept that was established by monks 1,500 years ago. And it was basically a list of kind of practices, commitments, habits that they had for themselves. And it wasn't a list of rules or laws to feel guilty about or shame about when they didn't hit it. It was more like a list of guides and guardrails to help them live the kind of lives they wanted to live and they felt like God was calling them to. And while we're not monks today, many of us, most of us probably are not. The monks are all probably watching online today, perhaps. But that we can still learn something really valuable here. And that is that we should put in place a system, a rule of life that's kind of our own set of practices and commitments. Think of it like this. Think of it like a lattice. This is the analogy we've been using. If you've ever studied a grapevine before, then you know that without the structure that the grapevine grows upon, it actually grows along the ground and it doesn't produce a lot of fruit. But when you give it the structure and you give it the support, it gives it what it needs to produce the kind of fruit. And the same is true in our life. That when we put the sort of system in place with habits and practices in the key areas of our life, we experience growth and ultimately growing closer to our Heavenly Father as well. And so we've talked about a couple of key areas. We've talked about faith being the first and foremost, core relationships, relationships in community with one another. And to tell you about the key area where we want to have daily practices that align with our deepest values today, I want to share with you a quick story about a guy named Paul Dean. He was a guitarist in the 80s, and one day he was having trouble songwriting. And one day he walks out to the beach, and he's in Vancouver, he's Canadian, walks out to the beach, and he begins to try to figure out how to write this song he's been trying to discern. And he has this realization. He looks around, and he sees that he's completely alone. And then he has this question, where is everybody? And he realizes, well, it's the middle of the week. So everybody is working, they are living their lives, and they are just waiting for the weekend to come. And so you might know the song. He wrote the lyrics from this experience. Everybody's working for the weekend. Yeah, there were more people in first service who knew that song than you guys here today. But everybody's working for the weekend. This is the lyrics he wrote. Everybody's working for the weekend. Everybody wants a new romance. Everybody's going off the deep end. Everybody needs a second chance. The song captures a very relatable sentiment that there are times in our life where it just feels like we are just in the grind, where it's like this hamster wheel where we're just going day after day after day. It is 9 to 5 at work, building a career, shuttling kids around, paying the bills, taking care of the house. I mean, it is just week after week after week, and it can feel like there are moments where we are just yearning and waiting for some rest and reprieve from all the things that are in our life. And it's this sentiment that we're always kind of living in this way where we tend to take this approach where we live restless, where we are like this tank and we're just feeling like we're always running on fumes and we're trying to fill it back up, but it's getting replenished week after week, and we have this posture of living restless. I think if we were to take a step back and not even think about our own lives for a moment, but just look at culture and society, particularly here in America today, there's a couple of things that I would say indicate that this tends to be the default approach to how we live in our culture today. And here's a couple of things I would say would support that. 77% of employed Americans report experiencing burnout at work. It's a 2024 study. So over 3/4 of us are experiencing some sort of burnout at work, and that's important because work is a good thing. It is not meant to be done restlessly all the time, so there is something off there. 38% of us get less than 7 hours of sleep per night. And you might think to yourself, well, that's not so bad. If I can get by on 6 hours, it's not a big deal, right? It's a little bit humbling when you discover that prior to the invention of the light bulb, when artificial light came about 150, 200 years ago, prior to that, the average amount of sleep that people got per night was 11 hours a night, which is a little bit humbling and staggering when we think about, I don't remember the last time I got 11 hours of sleep at night, honestly. The third one I want to draw your attention to is because of that, perhaps it is that we spend 4 hours daily feeling tired. If we minus maybe the average 8 hours that we would like to get, we have 16 waking hours a day, so 1/4 of those every day. This is a 2024 study done just this last year. 1/4 of our waking hours is spent just feeling tired. You get the idea here. And I don't have to spend a whole lot of time telling you what you maybe already know or already feel. We tend to live our lives very restlessly. And it's no wonder when we meet somebody new or we kind of check in with somebody, hey, how are you doing? Our default response, it's kind of a cop-out response, but our default response is, I'm busy. And we kind of take that as a synonym for, oh, well, that must be good, right? This is our culture. This is our world. And if you are anything like me, and maybe the demands and responsibilities of life have left you often feeling tired, worn out, exhausted, then perhaps in our own individual lives that there has been a moment where the pendulum has swung too far to the other side. And don't hear me wrong, I'm all for working hard and making a name for yourself, making a life for yourself. But there are moments where it's almost like it swings so far to the other side where we are working and living restlessly to the point that we can't even enjoy the lives. So today, I want to explore what it might be like to not live restless, but instead to move and live and breathe and operate in our lives from the goodness and joy and peace found in a life that is full of rest. And that might sound a little idealistic and unattainable to some of you, depending on your situation, depending on your season of life, and I get that. But I genuinely believe it's possible for all of us because it is intrinsically already a part of who we are. I want to explain what I mean by that. Thousands of years ago in a book called Genesis, the first book of the Bible in the Old Testament, and I caveat with this, if you're a follower of Jesus, then you're in on this, you're like, okay, what does it say? You might know the story already. If you're not a follower of Jesus, then I think it's still helpful because whether it's poetic or metaphorical or literal, when we read Genesis, it is such a helpful commentary on just the human life and struggle. So I think you can still get something from this. But in Genesis 1, this is what happens, kind of a summary of what happens, the very first couple pages of the Bible. God creates on day 1 light and darkness, and then on day 2 sky and sea, and day 3 the land, day 4 the sun and moon, day 5 the birds and fish, day 6 animals and humans, and this is the important part. Humans are made in God's image. Being made in God's image is arguably the most significant thing about you, because it prescribes intrinsic worth and value to your very existence. Because you were made to reflect the character, nature, and attributes of God. That's what it means to be made in God's image, which gives so much weight to what God then does on the 7th day. If you've read this, and you might already know what he does. On the 7th day, God had finished his work of creation, so he rested from all of his work. And God blessed the 7th day and declared it holy because it was the day where he rested from all of his work of creation. The word holy there, that means it's just set apart. So these other 6 days had a different purpose, but this day was set apart. It was a day to rest and enjoy life and enjoy everything that had been created, which is wild when you think about this narrative right here, because this is God, the God of the universe, the Alpha, the Omega, existing outside of time and space, and he takes a day to rest. That's wild because what we tend to do is we project our own kind of restless mindsets on this when we read it, and we might subconsciously think to ourselves, well, God must have rested because he was tired. But we forget that God is God. God does not have limits. God does not get tired. He rests on the 7th day because it is a part of who he is, his nature, his character, his attributes. And we see this in how he blesses the 7th day. To bless something in a Hebrew context is to wish happiness on something. God wishes happiness on this 7th day because it is a day to rest and enjoy life. God was happy on the 7th day, which means for you and I, because we are made in God's image, that we are also made to rest as well. That we were not made to keep our head above water all the time. That we were not made to live restlessly, or as some people might say, to just sleep when we're dead, right? That's not how we're made. We were made to rest because rest is an aspect of being human. It is not for weak people. It is for wise people who just understand and accept their limitations. One of the people I've learned about a lot with this topic in particular is a man named Jeff Henderson. And I heard a sermon from him maybe 14, 15 years ago on this, and I still remember pieces of it because it was so impactful. And he is a pastor, he's an author, he actually is responsible, if you go to the Chick-fil-A Bowl, he's responsible for all the cows that get thrown on the field because it used to be the marketing executive at Chick-fil-A when that happened, and it was a whole accident. He has a whole story about it. It's wild. But he is now a business coach and leader, and he writes this in his book, What to Do Next. I love this. He says, whenever I talk about this, meaning the importance of rest in the business world, people look at me like I've either lost my mind or I don't know what it's like out there in the real world. That's when I ask them, that might be how some of you are thinking or responding right now too. That's when I ask them if they've ever helped win a world war. The answer is no, always. And then I point to Winston Churchill, the British Prime Minister who helped win World War II against unbelievable odds. And then look at this, it's so fascinating. He was famous for his speeches, his courage, and his wit. He was also famous for taking an afternoon nap every single day. With all due respect to you and me, Winston Churchill had a few more challenging things to do on his to-do list. I do want to call out that Winston Churchill was also famous for drinking a glass of whiskey with breakfast every day as well. But being like Winston is not the point here. The point here is no matter who you are, no matter how successful you might be, no matter how you view sleep and rest, you cannot get away from it. Rest is an aspect of being a human. To which I think many of us go, okay, if we are then to live restful, not living restlessly, but live lives full of rest, well, then what does that look like? What does that actually mean? How can we win in life in this area? And is it even possible with the various things you might be carrying in your life right now? And at this point in the message, I just want to pause for a moment because I recognize, having shared on this before and having talked to many people before about rest and rhythm and life and having done my own studies on it, I just want to recognize that often with a conversation like this, we tend to land in 3 different buckets. Not all of us, but I think this probably captures a lot of us in here. We tend to think either one, well, I love this message because this means I can now justify not working as hard in life because I'm made to rest, which is not the point of this at all. We're going to get to that in a little bit. Or we think 2, well, you know what I'm going to do to rest? I'm going to make a to-do list of all the things I can do to rest. And we try to productivity hack or kind of life hack our way there. Or 3, we just kind of write this off and go, Jeremy, if you knew my world, if you knew what was going on in my business and everything, then you would know this is just not possible. I understand and get all 3 of those in some way to my own degree. I told my wife what I was talking about this week, and she laughed. Like, she just laughed in response. I'm sharing on rest, and she chuckled. Because we're in a season where we're about to be, parents of 3 boys, 3 and under. So talking on rest, it's like, let's find the most tired guy possible to talk about rest. And that's what's happening here. So I get them to some degree, but at the same time, I would just challenge you to pause before you come to any conclusions on this topic. Because I believe you were made to rest, experience a fullness of rest, and also there is a foundation, a root of where that is supposed to come from in your life. And perhaps this is a different way of thinking about it, not avoiding hard things or life hacking your way to it, but perhaps something entirely different that you've never explored before. To look at that, what I want to do is zoom out on kind of the biblical narrative of rest as a whole. And to some of you in here, if you like the Bible and you like history, you're just like, yes, let's go, biblical narrative on rest. Others of you, like my wife Ashley, are like, okay, so we're going to turn it into a picture so that we can all follow along with a picture here, okay? So this is the biblical narrative of rest right here. We already looked at the beginning where God creates humans and he creates us to live restful. But what happens after that, if you've read the story, you know, Adam and Eve and our story every single day is we tend to take matters into our own hands and we live outside of God's design. So humans live outside of God's design. We do this every day and there are consequences to this. One of the bigger, theological, existential consequences is that there's a separation between humanity and God. Because God is perfect and just, then there is a separation between us and God. But the constant theme throughout the Bible is that God pursues people over and over and over again because he loves us. And so in the Old Testament, God pursues one particular group of people, the nation of Israel, who are chosen to be the chosen people through its reconciliation to him one day would come for all people. To kind of set up a temporary way for them to relate to him, because again, he's just, there is an old covenant established. This is what much of the Old Testament is about. And here's what's wild, if you've never thought about it this way, even if you've read some of the books that talk about the Old Covenant, God, within the Old Covenant, he gives the Israelites a plan for rest. He creates for them a rule of life to experience rest as he intended for them. There's daily things they do, practices, habits, and rituals. And then there's 3 things in particular that I want to call out because they're 3 very specific commands that he gives them. He says, every 7 days, just like him, they are to rest. This is the Sabbath day. And this is not like catch up on household chores. This is like rest and just enjoy life. That's what you're supposed to do. Every 7 years, this is where it gets a little crazy, is a sabbatical year. The sabbatical year was a year of Sabbath. And it was a day where you actually didn't reap or harvest, a year where you didn't reap or harvest, and you just let the land replenish. And then every 7 sabbatical years, you had the year of Jubilee. And this is where it gets really wild when we think about just how we approach life in our restless lives. It was a year of complete reset for the nation of Israel. What would happen is all slaves and servants would be freed to go home. All property would be given back to its original owners. All debt would be forgiven. There would be no reaping or harvesting, completely replenish the land, and people would fully rest and reset for a year, every 50 years on the year of Jubilee. This was God's rule of life for the ancient nation of Israel. But what happens is what happens every day in our life is we have a hard time doing things that we know are good for us. And this is what Israel does. And so they have this roller coaster ride, and they're unable to keep the old covenant, which means it was temporary, it was old, it needs something better in its place, which takes us to the new covenant, where one day there would not be a set of laws and rules and practices to help them experience rest, but rest would not come through practice, but through a person, the Messiah, the one to reconcile all people back to God once for all. And here is where Jesus comes on the scene. This is amazing when you see it with this kind of context behind us, because one day, Jesus gets up on a Sabbath day in his synagogue in his hometown. So think it's Nazareth. All of his friends and family, they've watched him grow up. And he gets up in front of his friends and family. He just got done fasting for 40 days, 40 nights. Many people see this as a symbol of the beginning of his ministry. And they hand him a scroll. And it's the scroll of Isaiah, full of Old Testament prophecies about the Messiah. And he opens it to his place of choosing. And this is what he begins to read. And here's where you see all that context becomes really important for us. The Spirit of the Lord is on me, because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners and recovery of sight for the blind, to set the oppressed free. This is talking about the gospel, the good news. And then look at this, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. The year of the Lord's favor is a reference to the year of Jubilee. It's saying that there is a person that will come one day, he's reading a prophecy here, and they will fulfill this prophecy in such a way that they will not only reconcile all people back to God once for all, but all the realities of the year of Jubilee, the peace, the goodness, the rest, the joy, will now be available to everyone all the time. He says all this in front of his friends and family. And then look at this. He rolled up the scroll, handed it back to the attendant, and sat down. All eyes in the synagogue looked at him intently, because they're figuring out what he is starting to say here. Then he began to speak to them. The scriptures you've just heard have been fulfilled to this very day. He says the person that this talks about, the person where ultimate rest can be found, is here. And he says, it is me. They get so mad at him because of how blasphemous this would have been, that they actually take him out of the town to a cliffside to push him off the cliff and kill him. And we know that's not how his story ends. Then a couple of months or years later in his ministry, he has the famous verse on rest that kind of just spells it all out so clearly for you and I today. He says this, "Come to me, all of you who are weary and carry heavy burdens." Which I just want you to think about your own life for a moment. If you find yourself weary, exhausted, carrying heavy burdens from the responsibilities of life that you've been carrying, Jesus is not just saying this to his guys back then. He says it to you and I today. He says, come to me, all of you who are weary and carry heavy burdens. And then he says, I will give you rest for your souls. This is the foundation, the root of where we are to experience that fullness of rest that we are designed for. Where we are to live restful, rooted in Jesus. Not avoiding hard things in life, and not some life hack or productivity tip, but in a person, the person of Christ. To which I think an honest response is, well, why does that make us more rested, right? And the reason is because when you begin to follow Jesus and you do it day after day, year after year, it becomes apparent as to the real deeper down reasons for the restlessness you have in your life. It's almost like a mirror is put up when you follow Jesus at your own very heart and soul, where you begin to look in the mirror as you follow him and you recognize, oh, I've been striving and I've been working tirelessly day after day after day. And I say it's to provide and all that's good, but it's really because I need to prove myself. I need to prove I'm enough. I need to disprove what that person said about me all those years ago. And so you're exhausted because of it. But you see, following Jesus, you begin to realize and discover that you're already proven through what he did on the cross for you. It is a stamp of identity that no amount of wealth in the bank account or success in life could ever give you. It's better than all of that. You are a son or a daughter of the Most High God. And in that, you can rest. It's in recognizing that perhaps you're like me and you are slightly a control freak, if you're honest. Maybe you're a perfectionism. You stare at your calendar and your to-do lists a lot, and you want to line everything and control the outcomes and feel really good. And perhaps if you're honest, your emotional state is really predicated upon what is left on the to-do list. If that's true for you, following Jesus puts a mirror up to your soul that says, hey, life is more important than the things that are left on your to-do list. There are more significant things in life. There are people. There is a life to be lived outside of what is perhaps left undone in your life. Following Jesus shows us that if we've been driven to please people all the time, and loving and serving people is a good thing, we should do that. But if we've been driven to please people, maybe if we're honest, not from a place of love, but from a place of fear of what might happen if someone is disappointed in us, and so we're exhausted from working so hard to do that, following Jesus shows us we don't have to be worried about what other people think. Yes, we want to love and care for people, but there is already someone far greater whose opinion of us is the most important one that counts, and that's our Heavenly Father. Following Jesus shows us that if we've been driven by fear or worry of what might happen, and so we shore up every part of our life, but we are tired of doing that, following Jesus shows us that we can't predict outcomes. We don't know what's going to happen. We can't control it all, but we can trust one who can in this life and the life to come one day. This is why fullness of rest is rooted in Him. One of my favorite resources on this topic is a book called The Ruthless Elimination of Hurry by a guy named John Mark Comer. He's kind of an expert. We've done groups before around this book because it's that helpful. And he says this so simply in his message, in his book. He says, hurry is not just a disordered schedule. Hurry or restlessness is a disordered heart. It's a disordered heart. There's a deeper thing going on here with our restlessness, which means it's not a life hack. It's not avoiding difficult things. It is actually going to happen as a result of us excavating through the various layers of our heart that most keep us from resting and trusting in God. It makes me think of that passage where Jesus said, where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. And we tend to think of treasure just as money, but for the purposes of today, I would expand that to also include our most valuable assets. I think we'd all agree, our time, our attention, our energy. Where we cannot or will not invest our time, energy, and attention in resting, see, that is a matter of the heart. And the challenge here, to summarize all of this, the challenge here for all of us is this: to live restful, rooted in Jesus from the heart. Not at a superficial level, not by life hacking, but truly, genuinely from the deeper place in our heart within all of us. And so you might be thinking to yourself at this point, what does that look like? If we were to get practical and tangible, what does that actually mean for us? Because our whole goal has been to align our daily practices with our deepest values. And if we are to win with rest, what does that mean? And I think first we have to start with what our value system is. And I love what the Apostle Paul says when he says this. This is where we are to begin. He says, make it your ambition. And if you're a driven person in here, or you're success-oriented, or you're a high achiever, perhaps you just got excited because you're like, oh, ambitions, I love ambitions, right? Because ambitions come from our heart. It is those deeper places within us of what we most deeply desire. And so you might be like, all right, I love ambitions, right? Look at what he says. Make it your ambition to lead a quiet life. I mean, I don't know if there's a verse that is perhaps more countercultural than one of these right here. Make it your ambition to lead what? A quiet life? That is so opposite to the flow of the restlessness that we all experience. But this is where Paul is saying, if you want to begin to experience a fullness of rest, it begins with your value system. And it begins with what you most deeply desire, and you are to make it your ambition to live a rested, faithful, quiet life. Some of you in here hear that and you're like, oh, no. And something rises within you and pushes back. And I just want to say with all love and empathy, that is perhaps a matter of the heart. That is perhaps something to address in your heart. And then there are those of you who read a passage like this, or even this whole message, and you think to yourself, I love this message. Like, I'm going to go home and take a nap, and I'm going to sleep in tomorrow. I'm going to call in sick to work, put on Netflix. Like, oh, this is so good. Yes, we got to rest. God told me rest, right? Some of you in here are there. That is also a matter of the heart, which is why I think it's important to include the rest of this passage, just to be clear here. Okay, it says this: make it your ambition to lead a quiet life. You should mind your own business and work. Key word there, work with your hands, just as we told you, so that your daily life may win the respect of outsiders, and so you will not be dependent upon anybody. I'm sure there's like aspiring empty nester parents in here that are wanting to like take a picture of this and send it to their early 20s children somewhere, right? You are meant to work. God worked for 6, rested for 1. We tend to read this passage and think, oh, Paul says live a comfortable life. That's not what he says. He lives a quiet life. And where our aim has been ease and comfort, perhaps we actually need to get to work. And this is why we're actually going to talk about that very topic next week. Today, part of the challenge for all of us, though, is I want us to begin to think differently about this word, tired. We use this word predominantly negative all the time, but we also use busy as positive. And perhaps for some of us, we need to switch how we view these words. Because tired, in its original intent, tired is not a bad thing. And I'm not talking about perpetually exhausted all the time or restlessly living all the time. If you are in a season that doesn't have an end date, then perhaps it's not a season. And perhaps there's a value system that needs to be addressed there. To get back to the original intent of tired is to think about it in the sense of, getting to the end of the day, and maybe for you it's ending work or ending school or just putting your kids down, whatever it might be, and you have that moment for a second where you breathe and you go, I am so tired. And instead of going, that must be bad, you go, I'm tired because I did something good today. I contributed value to the world. I created something. I parented. I worked hard. And from that place, tired is a very good thing, and it is from that place that we learn what it means to truly, fully rest. And so the challenge today, it is a matter of the heart, but we address matters of the heart with the things that we do every single day, which is why at the end of each message throughout this series, we've been getting down to this question and asking ourselves, what is your plan to win? And in this particular topic, what is your plan to win with rest? If you were to create a plan, perhaps a rule of life with rest, what would that look like for you? I want to spend the remaining couple minutes we have just creating a list of ideas and suggestions and examples of what a plan of rest could look like for you. Not with the intention of perfectly executing something and life hacking. Again, it is to live restfully rooted in Jesus from the heart. And so I want to share with you a list of ideas, but I don't want to overwhelm you in just a moment. I just want you to pick one of these things. Some of you in here are high achievers, and you instantly thought, I'm picking 2. No, just pick one of these things and apply that to your own rule of life, whatever that might look like for you. Here's an example of what this can look like. A rule of life, instead of practices and commitments that you do daily, weekly, monthly, quarterly, annually. At the end of this time, we're going to fill this whole thing out, and I would suggest for you to maybe snap a picture of it if it's helpful for you, or just to help you think about what it might be for you. When we look at the life of Jesus, he didn't explicitly tell us any specific commands around resting, but we know in following him, we are to imitate things that he did, and there are 2 specific practices he did to rest on a regular basis. Number 1 is he had a daily time with God. The time with God was a place for him to get away alone and quiet, where he would spend time praying or in scripture, and he would read and connect with God, rest with God, trust God with his life. And we've talked about this one a lot before, so I'm not going to spend as much time here. The second one that he did that I want to spend more time on is the Sabbath. We've talked about it a little bit already. It's just a word that comes from Jewish ancient tradition. And it is essentially, in its most basic form, a 24-hour period of rest. It is not resting in that you use it to catch up on all your housework. It is actually where you rest from all the things you need to do, and you instead spend a day each week doing all the things you want to do, the good things for you, not just the bad things you want to do, the good things you want in your life. This means that, just take a step back and think about this. If God is for you and he loves you and he wants you to live restfully, of course then he would put a day in your week every week where you just got to do the things that most fill up your soul and give you rest. And that is what the Sabbath is. And if 24 hours sounds crazy, then I would just challenge you to explore what it might be to start with 4 hours, 6 hours, 8 hours, 12 hours. Do it not as you can't, just begin as you can, right where you are. It's not about perfection. It is about just pursuing what this restful life could look like. A few years back, my wife Ashley and I, we were beginning to have a family, and we both worked here at Northpoint, and we just worked all the time. And so we knew that if we were to copy and paste our rhythms into having a family, it was not going to go very well. And she was becoming a stay-at-home mom, and so we made some adjustments, learned about this topic, and we began to try out this whole idea of Sabbath. And I would just say, if you're planning on having kids is not a good time to try to think about what rest looks like in your life. Just because it became this roller coaster ride of trying and failing and learning not to have expectations and give grace to ourselves. And so we've just tried and failed along the way. But for us today, here's what our Sabbath looks like. It's Friday night to Saturday night, and it begins with a dinner. And we usually, have dinner with our boys right here. And you can see it's nothing fancy. It's paper plates, Maui costumes, skull bottles. It just is, it's simple. And we do this because we want to keep it as simple as possible to rest. And the meal usually is either 1 minute to 20 minutes, depending on the mood and forcefulness of my children. And we light these 2 candles to begin it. And this is not a weird thing, I don't think. It is just something that we do that's an ancient tradition. It is to symbolize resting in God and remembering his faithfulness. Grayson will often go, "We rest and we remember." That's what he does. They love it. After dinner, they know, they expect it, they love it. Sometimes we'll go to H-E-B, get candy, and we do popcorn and movie, and we put all these things out on the floor of our living room, make it dark, and they get to put candy in their bowls, and then they get to yell at us when they get to the end of their bowls, and there's no more candy left, and all this thing. So you can just recognize that it is far from perfect. That's what it begins like for us. And then the next day, because Ashley's with the boys all week and I miss them, I will usually take them away and give her some time to, quiet and nobody asking her for anything, and she can go get coffee with the friend. And then when the boys go down for a nap, I kind of view it more as my time at that point. And that is because what I had to discover is that many of us in here perhaps maybe work with our minds all week. And for a lot of time, I would work with my mind, and then I would go to boys are napping and go to rest and be like, all right, let's rest. We're going to rest now. Okay, we're going to rest. Here we go. And I was so restless when I would do that because I had to see that because I work with my mind all week, I actually need to rest with my hands. And for those of you who work with your hands all week, it might be best to rest with your mind. And so for me, getting out on a trail and hiking or sweating or being in the garage and building something is where I most find rest on Sabbath for us. And that's it. That's what it looks like for us. And it's far from perfect. It's just what we try to do every week, and we've learned and grown, and the challenge here is to perhaps explore what that might be for you. But I want to end, only a couple more minutes here, so I'm going to fly through these last couple of slides, but I want to end by just filling up that chart with what could be the beginning of an idea or example of what a rule of life can be for you. So here's a couple things you could think about. What you do with your screens, maybe. Charging your phone somewhere else, watching one less episode, turning screens off, taking social media off for a weekend. Oh my gosh, what would happen in our life if we were to do that? Some of us just were forced to do that because TikTok, we didn't re-download it. So yeah, if you know. And it might also be taking a midday walk, getting outside, going on a hike, reading a fiction book. It could be connecting with other people if you're a people person, getting coffee with a friend, hosting a guys or girls night. It could be learning to sleep again. We've been talking about that today. Maybe you set an alarm to go to bed. Crazy idea. I have an alarm on my watch at 8:30 every night, and it drives Ashley insane because we never go to bed when it goes off. But it's like, okay, I should start thinking about potentially going to bed when this thing goes off. Maybe it's don't set an alarm at all once a week. That's another crazy idea perhaps. Or it's, blocking out an empty weekend, taking a day trip, going on vacation, a solo retreat. It does look different for all of us. The challenge here, though, is to just make a plan. Make a plan, and then try it, And then give yourself a lot of grace, manage your expectations, and evaluate at a heart level, how did it go? If you had such a hard time resting, I want you to ask yourself, why? Why did I have a hard time resting? Is it work? Is it success? Is it fear? Is it worry? Where is that rooted? And from that place, make a plan, try the plan, evaluate at a heart level what happened, and try it again. And learn, and rest, and fail, and learn, and grow, and rest. And for me personally, my hope for you is that you'd get to experience what I've come to discover are these little tiny pockets of rest where you kind of have this realization where you go, oh, that's what God wanted for me. And it's like this feeling of peace and enjoyment, like a moment that is set apart from the rest of all the other moments. My prayer and hope is that you'd be able to experience that. But it's not a result of great intentions. It's as a result of aligning your daily practices with your deepest value and making rest rooted in Jesus from the heart one of your deepest values in your life. Let me pray for us. Heavenly Father, thank you so much that you created us to rest. And I know for a lot of us in here that puts us at different places in what we think and feel about that, and that's okay. God, I just ask that you would give us the wisdom and the courage to excavate through the layers of our own heart and discern what most keeps us from resting. God, put before us not a list of to-dos, but something that we can try to begin to experience the rest that you have for us. And God, I just pray for all of us in here that you would show us what a deep rest from the soul can actually look like. God, we love you. We need you. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. Guys, thank you so much for being here. I hope you get some rest today, and we'll see you next week.